Okay, let's get going. Hi everyone, I'm Anna Bardos, a member of ACAN Circular Economy Group, and I'm super thrilled to welcome so many of you to this, the fourth of our 9-part Circular Economy event series. It's really exciting to see so much interest in this subject. It's being recorded. To avoid any background noise, microphones will be kept muted, but we do want to hear from you. So if you have questions for our speakers, please type your question in the chat box and we will come to them later. So a really very quick intro to ACAN. ACAN's a network of individuals within architecture and the built environment taking action to address the twin crises of climate and ecological breakdown. We have 3 overarching aims: decarbonize now, ecological regeneration, and cultural transformation. Our growing network is formed around thematic groups as depicted, and watch this space, we have a new group in formation for natural materials. We work together to create a change via many means, including campaigning, research, lobbying, knowledge sharing. If you'd like to join any of these groups, please join the WhatsApp and Telegram broadcast channels. We'll post the links in the chat. Just to let you know about a couple of campaigns we have going on. The one is the successful launch with a lot of cross-industry support for our Decarbonise construction campaign. There's 748 signatures so far, and please spread the word about this campaign. This campaign is actually part of the which are happening today as a finalist. If you're free between 3 and 4:30, you could join. I think we're putting the link in the chat now, and please vote for this campaign. ACAN also recently assisted the Green Party in preparing this parliamentary petition on VAT reform to create a tax incentive to favour retrofit instead of demolition and new build. Please join us to push Parliament for action on this. Link in the chat. And also going live today are sign-ups for next week's launch of the Students' Climate Action Network, a new arm of ACAN planning to facilitate intra-university collaboration, events and knowledge sharing, highlighting the immense power of student agency. So this is a continuation of ACAN's climate curriculum campaign, seeking to embed ACAN's core aims into the curriculum. Link in the chat for that. That we don't have time to shout out to all of them, please join me, pass the action. I'm just hearing that I've got a slightly unstable connection, so I'm going to stop video and hopefully that might help. I'm not sure if that has worked. So back to ACAN's Circular Economy Group, we're focusing on how circular economy principles can be applied to the UK construction industry, identifying opportunities, examples, plus some of the many barriers to implementing circularity in the UK context. The number of attendees throughout our talk series suggests many of you, like us, are super enthusiastic about circularity in theory, but are finding it difficult to implement in our construction projects. So we found experts from across the industry to dig down into the details of how to incorporate circularity meaningfully at each RIBA stage from 0 to 7. And we are planning a final event to develop a proposal for new stage 8, closing the circle with deconstruction and reuse. Tickets for the next event are available, so do snap one up, please. You can also catch up on previous events that you may have missed by checking out the event recordings on our YouTube channel. So to understand the context, here's a quick reminder of stage 3 taken from the RIBA Plan of Works, following stage 2, in which the architectural concept is agreed, aligned with the project brief. At stage 3, the design, including both architectural and engineering information, is spatially coordinated. This entails the architectural concept, resulting in spatially coordinated design aligned to an updated cost plan, project strategies, and outline specification. The design would be reviewed against building regulations, and a planning application would be submitted, if not already, at stage 2. And then, other than in traditional procurement, during this stage is when a contractor may be appointed or discussions with candidates would have commenced. So, on today's event, today we're delighted to be joined by Georgina Chamberlain. Georgina is an associate sustainability consultant at BuroHappold and is currently leading the research and development of circular economy strategies within the company economy working groups since 2017, including the development of the Circular Economy Guide for construction clients and current review of circular economy metrics. As a chartered civil and structural engineer by background, and accredited BREEAM consultant, Georgina's passion for making circular economy thinking the norm in construction is grounded in practical experience of taking projects from brief through to handover and operation. A second speaker is Taleen Josefsson. Taleen is an American registered architect who applies a holistic approach to tackling the complex environmental and social issues relating to the built environment. She's devoted to promoting healthy, low-energy architecture within local communities, economies, and biodiversity. Her most recent work includes research and publication on building material reuse as a method for reducing the industry's negative environmental impact, with a proposed circular working method of form follows availability. The research includes reviewing local waste streams, identifying and analysing potential building materials and their applications, and considering material life cycles and chemical contents. She now works as a Thrive project manager at Chetwoods, advising on sustainable circular practice and implementation, both within the firm and for external clients. She's also an active member of the ACAN Circular Economy group and Changing Streams, an organisation working to reduce plastic in the construction industry. So Georgina and Taleen will be discussing how circular economy principles can be incorporated within stage 3, including real life examples. We hope to keep the session to 50 minutes. So we'll hear first from our two presenters, after which will be Q&A. Please do post your questions in the chat. Also, we have an interactive Miro board to which everyone is invited to contribute and continue the discussion. We will put unanswered questions from the chat onto this later, and speakers will have a chance to answer them after the event. This will also form the basis of a resource we'll produce at the end of the series, so all contributions are very welcome. The Miro board will be open for the next 2 weeks, so please do check in and continue the conversation. Okay, enough from me. I'm delighted to hand over to Georgina to kick off our stage 3 discussion.
Brilliant, thanks Hannah. It's an absolute pleasure to be talking to this network. We've had some amazing speakers so far, so it's a bit of a tough act to follow, and but hopefully I'll be building on what they have been saying so far. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, so hopefully my screen is sharing okay. So yeah, firstly I thought just to start off with this this image, because I think it's quite powerful at stage 3. I think trying to lock in circular economy can feel like a bit of a leap of faith, but I think this photo captures quite nicely with kind of collaboration across the industry. The outcomes can be will be very exhilarating, so it's kind of worth that leap of faith into it. I suppose to kind of recap on what's been said so far, as Anna mentioned, at stage 0, we've all kind of built up the business case for the clients. At stage 1, we've got that client buy-in, and at stage 2, the kind of fun bit of where you're brainstorming and establishing the key strategies. And stage 3 is kind of crunch point, really. It's when you have to get really serious about locking in circularity, understanding how you're going to manage and monitor it going forward, but you're starting to create the kind of documentation that sets the pathway for your projects going forward in terms of your specs, your cost plan, planning application, and any tender documentation. So it's quite a crucial stage. So over the next 10-15 minutes, I was just going to talk a little bit about how you can manage and monitor circularity. So what are the metrics that are being discussed out there? And then I was going to dive into the kind of key circular economy principles and what they mean for your kind of planning, tender and kind of cost plan, and just picking up some lessons learned and discussions that I've had on projects and working groups on these topics. So starting with metrics, I'm sure you've all heard this saying before, that you can't improve what you don't measure. So I'm a very big believer of just really kind of capturing in a material inventory what is coming into your building and what is going out. And I think until you have that granularity of information, it's quite hard to drive change and discussions within the industry. Appreciate material inventories can be quite daunting for projects. So this is an example of a good tool that's been mentioned in some of the previous talks. But the Regenerate tool by the University of Sheffield is less of a material inventory, but more of a like a checklist against the key principles that you could just peg yourself against. It's best used at stage 1 and 2 to drive that strategy conversation, but at stage 3 you could equally use it as a bit of a checkpoint to see where improvements can be made, where the opportunities still are, and also a bit of a document to capture your kind of commitments going forward. But as mentioned, big believer in spending a little bit of time in getting their material inventories set up in its most simplest form. It could be just on a spreadsheet. So here I've just got a quick snapshot of what you would capture for the GLA circular economy sort of statements. But at the kind of other end, there's a lot of discussions in the industry at the moment around creating kind of digital twins and using them as a basis for capturing your material passports. So yeah, watch this space. I think eventually that's where we will move to. In between, at BuroHappold, we started using the one-click LCA Building Circularity Index tool. So this is a bit of a plugin into the one-click LCA software that we use to do our life cycle assessments. And this software basically captures some additional information about the materials being brought into your building. So is it regenerative? Is it recycled? Have you reused it in situ or from elsewhere? And then it gets the team thinking about what happens to your materials at the end of life. So it's forcing that discussion now, line by line, to say, okay, you brought this material in, what's going to happen to it? Is it something the manufacturer can take back, or something that you can design for adaptability or recovery at the end of life? And overall, the software creates this kind of circularity index, so you can start to benchmark across your projects. But there's a lot of discussions over whether more kind of aggregate metrics or this kind of overall metrics is important. But I think the key message is really to start kind of measuring something, and then you can start to understand where the issues are. So as mentioned, this circularity tool is basically building on the life cycle assessment model. So if you were doing a detailed LCA model, you'd be capturing a lot of information about the material quantities anyway, and hopefully might be pegging it to environmental product declarations to understand exactly where these components, what their impacts are. And the building circularity tool basically allows you to just add another layer of information around its recycled contents, whether it can be kind of designed for disassembly or adaptability throughout its life, or what kind of happens to it at the end of life. So there's a few sort of default values that the software puts in based on their experience of the kind of supply chain in the UK. But equally, if you can have that detailed conversation with your supply chain, you can start to adjust and improve on what's there already. So just a quick example for a office fit out that had high circular economy aspirations. So early days, all that discussion with the design team of like using as much that was there already as possible, minimizing kind of finishes, etc. But once we kind of modeled the building, we could then get all the data out of one click, analyze it in sort of spreadsheets. As an engineer by background, I love a good spreadsheet and manipulating the data. So here it kind of highlighted to the team that actually by sorting it by the products with the highest sort of virgin material content, we sort of saw that the PVC, sort of the vinyl flooring, was the biggest impact. And then equally pairing that data with the embodied carbon, you could see that the vinyl had a huge embodied carbon as well. And then when you look at the kind of healthy materials conversation, there's all the alarm bells started ringing to say, okay, as a team, let's see what we can do to sort of design this out. So by taking that deep dive, you can really drive the conversation around where the impacts actually are and where you should focus your resource and efforts into change. So next section of my presentation, I was just going to go through the kind of key principles of the circular economy and just start to talk about how these, what are the issues with locking these in the context of sort of planning your tender documentation and your cost plan. So I'm sure you're all familiar with these principles. There's a lot of different frameworks out there and a lot of different ways of framing it, but I quite like using these sort of 4 principles of just using less new. If you need to use new, use it responsibly. How can you then become a custodian for that material and use it for as long as possible? And then eventually, how can we make sure that we can use it again? So starting with using less new. So this is very much around that high recycled content products, or kind of reusing materials in situ or from elsewhere. So the obvious kind of planning issues are probably around sort of aesthetics. I think when it's not a new material, there might be some nervous around what it looks like. If you need to refurbish products, you might not actually have that final vision of what it looks like yet. So kind of building time into your program for kind of material samples and having that conversation with the sort of planners and the client is quite important. And then I suppose regulations, meeting building regs is usually quite a big topic that kind of comes up with reuse. But again, getting the right technical specialists around the table, understanding and programming in any sort of studies and testing that needs to be done can overcome that quite sort of quickly. So as an example, on the left there at the UCL School of Management, the team went in there with quite a sort of drive to try and reuse as much in this an existing office as possible, while still kind of transforming it into a kind of teaching sort of space. And they identified quite a lot of these kind of glazed partitions that could be reused. And so they involved our acoustic engineers and worked very closely with Optima, the suppliers, to actually go through that process of sort of testing and revalidating these systems so that they could be relocated and reused in the project. Then I suppose around sort of the cost plan, it's thinking about if you are sort of reusing things and stripping material out of existing buildings, where you're going to sort of store it, that might have an impact on your kind of cost and programming. Looking at kind of secondhand or high recycled content, it could be kind of cost neutral, a bit more expensive if you're limiting the supply chain, but quite often it could be a cost saving as well. So it's just as important to kind of capture any sort of value add, that kind of cost savings story to the client as well, so that they have the right frame of reference for the next kind of projects that looks at circularity more. In terms of tender documentation, I think it's important to kind of sort of challenge the contractor in the first instance to understand, have they got a track record for reuse? Have they got that kind of that ambition and the processes in place? And even if they don't, it just gets them sort of thinking that actually that's the type of mentality that we want on this project, not just a strip out, rip out as quickly as possible. We want a bit of care and a bit of collaboration with them to make sure that things are kind of kept. And then I suppose the kind of final point to kind of highlight here is that it's important to have alternatives if the reuse and the testing and the high recycled content aspirations aren't available. It's good to have that kind of backup plan and sort of show the contractor that the program won't sort of stop for an extensive redesign, but the team have thought through that kind of backup piece as well. In terms of just kind of highlighting some toolkits and metrics around it, how to kind of embed this into your documentation. I've mentioned sort of two things here. So firstly, sort of BuroHam, whilst BuroHam doesn't necessarily put circular economy as a sort of central focus point, they actually do have quite a lot of credits around the circular economy principles. So as a basic, if your team or your project hasn't got a strong circular economy strategy in place, there's still opportunity to engage with some of the principles through BuroHam, which is applied to most kind of non-residential projects in the UK. And I've also kind of flagged up the Regenerate tool as well, because I think it's a really great source of information, as well as a nice simple tool to use. They've got loads of case study references and lots of kind of best practice references. So it's a good kind of place for signposting to other resources. So it's worth a bit of a dip through. And then the UK Green Building Council last year released quite a good how-to guide and reuse as well. Touching on sort of metrics very sort of quickly. So this, I was just going to call this morning around sort of metrics. I know the BRE and this sort of circuit research project is doing quite a lot around what are the right metrics for the industry. So these metrics I've highlighted here, not necessarily the right ones or the be all and end all, but it's just picking out what can be measured at this point and what people are discussing about. So in the circular economy statement, they look at recycled and reused percentages within your building by construction value, and then within the one-click tool, they're looking at it from a sort of tonnage perspective. Here's just a quick link to the UK Green Building Council sort of guide as well, which is kind of nicely set out around what you need to do at each RIBA stage. So it's worth a bit of a dive into to get that kind of deeper sort of thinking that I've just talked about now. Next principle, using new responsibly. I suppose this is probably the one that we're kind of more familiar with as an industry, looking at kind of low carbon design and responsible sourcing. So kind of won't dwell on this sort of too much, but again, I suppose kind of key issues to sort of draw out are around, I suppose, the cost plans. Sometimes the high kind of accreditation for materials can limit your supply chain. So it's doing that early supply chain engagement just to understand that in the first place. Quite often, modular construction can bring quite a lot of benefit in terms of environmental impact and efficient construction on the site. So any assumptions around modular, it's important to get that into your tender documentation. And again, starting to sort of speak to the supply chains so that you can understand the different kind of contractual responsibilities and who's doing what. In terms of using new responsibly toolkits, again, the BuroHappold, you're probably all familiar with, there's lots of credits around measuring the responsible sourcing and the embodied carbon. The Regenerate tool has some great references as well. And then in terms of that kind of healthy material piece of using new responsibly, the Living Building Challenge certification scheme has a great section on kind of what they call red list materials, so materials that we should try and avoid on our projects. And in terms of metrics, the Circular Economy statements for the GLA, they look at kind of total material quantities of different material types. Interestingly, they started looking at material intensity as well, so we can start to create benchmarks and get a feel for whether if you're building that you've designed or is it got too much material in compared to other things. And the one-click LCA looks at kind of percentage renewable materials as well, so encouraging that use of kind of like things like wood, hemp, etc. Using for longer. So I suppose this probably has less kind of planning impacts. It's kind of less visual, but more about the scenario planning and the kind of organization of your materials and your space and the narrative that you play back to the planners and to the client and to the contractor. I think a couple of things on cost plan. I think sometimes when you're doing kind of looking at adaptive kind of capacity and sort of future changes, it might kind of lead you down the route of looking at how do you sort of zone your spaces up for shared sort of use so that you can increase the utilization on your project a lot more. And this is an example on the Cope Live Arena that we're working on up in Manchester at the moment, where the discussions were on non-event days. Quite often arenas sort of stand kind of empty, but how can we zone it up in such a way that you could use smaller pockets of it? And how could you potentially have some of the concessions facing outwards on non-event days so that they're available for community use rather than just kind of boarded up when it's closed. And then in terms of sort of tender documentation, it's important to just get your assumptions around flexibility and adaptability across to the contractor so that when you start to engage in kind of value engineering, the dreaded sort of two words of every design team, but inevitable on a project, that we know what we need to protect. So if things come out, they might fundamentally sort of change the adaptability opportunities for the project. So quite important to communicate that across. And in terms of sort of toolkits, again, quite a few things in BuroHappold that you can dive into a little bit more. The Regenerate tool has the design for adaptability principle, which has a lot of case studies you can pick up. And then in terms of metrics, this is probably an interesting area that is a lot of people are head scratching around at the moment. Within the GLA, it's very much about sort of the narrative of how you approach this. Within one click, they are starting to look at whether you could kind of capture the percentage of materials that you could design for adaptability. But yeah, very much an area to that is in progress at the moment. And then obviously the use for longer piece, if you're looking at adaptability, flexibility, it's very important, as previous speakers have said, is to kind of look at that kind of building layers and service life of each of these areas so that your future proofing strategy is very much tailored to how long that item is going to be there for. And finally, kind of sort of using, again, I suppose from a planning perspective, this is a very kind of welcome sort of forward sort of thinking piece by planners. So I think capturing that in the sustainability narrative is quite a good kind of planning win for teams. So making sure that's very strong. If part of your reuse strategy is looking at kind of products as a service, it's making sure that agreements and the contractual responsibility splits are very much captured in your cost plan and your sort of tender documentation. And then so it's making clear that the contractor will also have to kind of capture additional things within the O&M sort of manuals that they hand across to the clients, so that the client will understand how the design intent has been put in place for disassembly and recovering the materials at the end of its life. In terms of sort of toolkits, again, sort of BuroHappold Regenerate has got some useful information you can dive into, and sort of metrics, as I mentioned before on the one-click tool, you can look at capturing percentage in sort of tonnage of reuse, recycled, and sort of downcycling. The circular economy statement looks at very sort of similar metrics, but from kilograms per meter squared, so you can start to capture data and create benchmarks. And then this is the kind of other UK Green Building Council how-to guide that they produced sort of last year that's worth diving into. So they looked at implementing Bite as a service, but quite a lot of the principles can be applied to other building components that are available to sort of lease instead of own at the moment. And then sort of final sort of parting sort of thought I just wanted to leave you with one of my sort of favourite quotes from Thomas Rauw, who's very much a pioneer sort of circular economy architects in the Netherlands, and he sort of said that waste is basically material without an identity. So I think the challenge then kind of goes out to everyone on the call really, and the industry is it's up for us as professionals to really kind of be creative and rethink and repurpose materials so that waste doesn't have to exist. Everything can be used as a resource. So that was a very whistle-stop tour through sort of stage 3. But yeah, any kind of thoughts? Always love to chat about circular economy. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Georgina. That was amazing. So much info and so thorough. And I can see a lot of questions have been generated in the chat, which is great. We're going to move on to Taleen now. And I think we've also got perhaps a little poll coming up just so we can find out a bit more about our audience. So please do fill that in. And yeah, please keep writing your questions for Georgina.
Okay, I'll just share my screen now while we're doing the polls. Can you see the screen? Okay.
Yeah, it's good.
Perfect, thanks. Let me just fix this. All right. I'm speaking to you today from Chetwoods, which was established in London in 1988. The Chetwoods brand has 3 key elements: Studio, Works, and Thrive. I'm part of the Thrive team. These components inspire, support, and complement each other. The grand concepts and imaginative leaps emanate from our studio. The Works champions the digital delivery of the projects and provides support to the teams in use of innovative software and hardware to deliver sustainable architecture with a measurable positive impact on human well-being and the environment. And the Works team is currently developing digital twins as a tool. And then the Thrive team supports in the design and delivery of quality architecture that improves our health and enhances our environment. My background is as a US registered architect and Passive House consultant with training in both the US and Sweden, as Anna mentioned earlier. And my previous work in circular economy includes academic research on building material reuse in a Swedish and European context. And I've been involved in the ACAN Circular Economy group since this past June. At Chetwoods, I'm a Thrive project leader where we act as both internal and external sustainability consultants, including helping to implement circular and net zero schemes. So I'm going to start out today by briefly explaining our approach and why and how we've integrated circular principles into our day-to-day. According to the 2020 Circular Gap Report, published this past January, the world is now 8.6% circular. And for all the discussion about circularity, this indicates a negative trend in action, down from 9% circularity reported in 2019 and 9.1% in 2018. According to the report, this negative trend can be explained by 3 key related underlying trends: high rates of extraction, ongoing stock buildup, and increasing but still low levels of end-use processing and cycling. These underlying trends are deeply embedded with the take, make, waste tradition of the linear economy, and the problems are hardwired. This frightening statistic demonstrates that significant changes need to be made across all industries, including the built environment. We who work within the built environment all have a role to play in implementing this change. So in response to this information, we've ensured that resources is one of our design drivers. This sits along with 6 other drivers that are aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals to ensure that we're designing holistically. These are carbon control, water, health and well-being, resilience, biodiversity, and value and cost. Throughout the design process, but especially at stage 3, resource and material selection are a crucial aspect of circular design. Across all projects, we apply circular economy principles referring to the 6 R's. These 6 R's have been developed in reference to research. This is the resource selection hierarchy in order of best to least desirable choices. Reduce the project brief or scope, including unnecessary materials and high embodied energy materials. Question if a new building or construction is really required. Retain existing buildings and materials if working with an existing building. Reuse materials and components as much as possible from local suppliers, including repair, refurbishment, and repurposing. Recycle, rot, reject toxic and unethical products, refuse and dispose of hazardous and unhealthy materials. If having to choose new materials, ensure that they have recycled content or are natural/biodegradable. Based on my earlier work, I've also identified 4 main strategies relating to the circular economy. These overlap with the themes identified with the UK GBC in their Circular Economy report. The main strategies are future transformation adaptation, design with and for reuse, healthy interior environments to promote well-being, and low environmental impact. Under each of these, you can find 3 sub-strategies, including designing in layers, designing in standard dimensions, detailing for disassembly, specifying healthy materials, and minimizing a building's footprint using all environmental impact indicators. We have a few case studies utilizing circular economy design principles that I could draw some lessons learned, but today I'll just focus on one, the Morden Whart project pictured at the bottom. Just a quick mention of the others though. The top image shows the Baytree Tech Hub, which won a Business Green Award and was nominated for the AJ100 Best Use of Technology Award. It was designed as a marketing hub that housed a BIM cave where clients could go in and see the virtual building model and select their finishes to avoid category B fit out waste. And then the other 2 in the center are images that are examples of our repurposing focus at Chetwoods, utilizing hidden spaces, which we implemented at Sainsbury's Digital Lab, which was once a basement level printing facility for the Daily Mail. And we're also maximizing unused spaces in our dark hotels and looking at future uses for NCP car parks. So today I'll discuss the Morden Whart project, where Chetwoods was appointed by UNI to develop the commercial element on a strategic industrial location that houses the former Tate & Lyle Sweeteners refinery. The challenge here was to provide a viable industrial solution that allows optimum flexibility while being bold with the design approach to create a cohesive community with the neighboring residential development. A variety of buildings have been proposed that include the conversion of an existing building that engages with the public realm, a new build warehouse for larger single operator, a business incubator for small mid-sized enterprises, and a makerspace facility for small creative industrial businesses, while creating a vibrant gateway to the development. The overall site will be redeveloped as a 178,000 square meter mixed use scheme, expected to deliver 1,505 homes with 35% affordable and a large riverfront park in addition to the industrial element. The project is currently in for planning. The primary focus today is to explain the scope of information provided in 2 stages of statements to the Greater London Authority Planning Office for this project, including the overall circular economy strategies and commitments. These statements were submitted at the RIBA stages 0 to 1 and 2 to 3 respectively for developments on the existing brownfield site and the alterations to the existing building, the facade of which can be seen here to the right. The Greater London Authority now requires that a circular economy statement be provided for referable applications at planning submissions. This is part of the London Plan Policy SI7, reducing waste and supporting the circular economy. There are 3 stages of statements to be delivered. First, the draft or outline statement, which is produced during RIBA stages 0 to 1. Secondly, the detailed statement at the full planning application during RIBA stages 2 to 3. And thirdly, the planning updates and post-completion updates undertaken during RIBA stages 4 to 7. The Morden Whart project qualifies as a referable application due to the number of residential units as well as the height of the residential unit. Chetwoods provided input for both the outline and detailed statements for the commercial buildings, while OMA contributed on the new residential buildings. And the process of collating the circular economy statement strategies and commitments was undertaken by the Morden Whart engineers, Ramble, for submission to planning. At step 1, the outline circular economy statement, we established the strategic approach and agreed to the circular metrics and targets. The decision tree provided in the GLA guidance document shown here can help prompt the designs team to choose a strategic approach. This tree is directly correlated to table 2 on the right from the 2019 UK GBC Circular Economy report that maps component length of life against design strategy. For short life components of 0 to 5 and 5 to 10 years, the overall strategy is to design for disassembly and return to manufacturer or design for reconfiguration using modular systems. In long life component planning, 20 to 30 years, the overall strategy is to design for maintenance, replaceability, and remanufacture. In even longer life component planning, 30 to 300 years, adaptability is the primary focus. In the outline statement, the strategic approaches we identified were organized by building layer. We are maintaining the existing structure and about half of the existing roof. Currently, the existing building is single occupancy, but it will be subdivided into multiple spaces to accommodate future tenants. Each unit is a shell and core finish with a tenant fit out. Strategic approaches for the renovation include providing ease of access to promote regular maintenance, all new components being designed for future disassembly and component reuse, including bolted steel structural elements, specification and standard non-specialized dimensions for future potential uses, on-site energy production with roof-mounted PVs, and utilizing sustainable resourcing policies and sourcing materials from within a reasonable radius to the project, contributing to reducing the building's embodied energy. The detailed circular economy statement was significantly more involved than the outline statement, as it required that we consider metrics that we would not typically have at this early stage. In response to the GLA request, Ramble actually provided a tool for us based on the required tables from the GLA statement guidance, which we then populated. And these included a bill of materials, recycling and waste strategies, end-of-life strategies, and metrics. We're doing a fairly light touch on this project, so at the moment, the main space is programmed for a brewery with a tap room and beer brewing uses, and therefore has minimal material calculations as the use remains fairly raw and industrial. However, it did require us to both review environmental product declarations, also known as EPDs, of relevant materials, as well as reaching out to manufacturers to inquire about materials' embodied carbon and material content if no EPD was already listed. Ahead of quantifying the new materials in the building, we had commissioned a point cloud survey, which was crucial in providing accurate material takeoffs. When filling out the bill of materials, we considered the material intensities for new materials to be installed in the existing building, as well as their end-of-use strategies. This was difficult for stage 3, as not all of the materials had yet been specified, but the spatial planning was complete. So in order to report the material intensities, we found the areas of materials, as well as source the weight of the materials from the EPDs or other available material data from the manufacturers. And material quantity was quantified by weight in kilos, as Georgina mentioned earlier, and the material intensity was then found by dividing the weight of each respective material by its area according to the model. The quantities and metrics required to fill in the tables are points that we wouldn't typically have thought about at this early stage, as I mentioned earlier. However, we can measure the metrics and targets, and then we can ensure that projects are delivered to meet our circularity goals. So the next steps are 5 takeaways and lessons learned from our research and work. The first concept is one that I illustrated in my research: form follows availability. Designing is no longer a linear process, rather it's iterative. As architects, we need to rethink how we design, and we need a modified, flexible, non-linear workflow. In the diagram, I've shown that the design concept is influenced by the local context analysis, project brief, and locally available materials. A preliminary idea of the design concept can help dictate the materials you aim to specify, but the actual local availability of materials and the access to specific materials at the time of construction can alter the design in both form and materiality. The process of form following availability continues throughout the building's use stage as maintenance or modifications are required, and ultimately the building or its components would be disassembled and re-enter the market to continue their lives. Materiality should be considered early on in the stages, even loosely at stages 0 to 1. In the case of Morden Whart, needing to have materials specified caught us off guard at stage 3. What we learned from Morden Whart is that we need to be prepared and understand what is in the materials that we're specifying. And fortunately, we're already building on this internally at Chetwoods. While we're waiting for the material passport and circularity tools to become more developed and standardized, we at Thrive have done our own analysis of the materials we specify regularly, including asking additional hard questions to the manufacturers, pushing them for cradle-to-cradle information. And questions like these include material origin, typical applications, chemical makeup, embodied carbon, water usage, expected lifespan, amongst a great deal of other data. And from this, we created our own internal material passports organized by building layer, where this information is required as part of the detailed circular economy statement, bill of materials, and end-of-life strategy tables. And drawing upon our 6 R's that I started off with the presentation, we know that using using virgin materials is not the best option, and we should look to materials already in circulation, such as those found in the existing building cadastre, thereby reducing further emissions and demand for virgin materials. The third takeaway is that we should look to identify locally available materials by creating a local resourcing map. Identify sources of salvage and secondhand materials to be applied in new construction and renovation. If no appropriate salvage materials are available, the scope of the search can be widened to include materials with recycled content and locally sourced bio-based products. In order of selection preference, relating back to our resource hierarchy of the 6 R's, first priority should be given to buildings to be demolished in the near future so that materials never have a chance to enter the waste stream. Secondly, select materials available at secondhand building material retailers. Thirdly, products available on the market from industry byproducts, post-recycling and post-consumer. And fourth, bio-based locally sourced products. Of course, you need to consider the trade-offs. For example, British steel is higher in embodied carbon than some of its European counterparts, and that's due to differences in production processes. The takeaway 4 is mining of existing buildings. When auditing existing buildings for materials, make sure the quality of data is good. On a project we did have a point cloud survey done, but by the time it stretched the full length of the building, the dimensions were not accurate. Here I've shown an example of what an audit might look like, including information on quantities, quality, reuse potential, and disassembly methods. This example was taken from my research in Sweden, where I visited a number of underutilized barns to create a series of material audits, where I quantified and qualified their existing material stocks. And after the initial building survey, I recreated the buildings in Rhino to get material takeoffs and create a catalog from which to shop for a new office proposal utilizing over 80% reused materials. And finally, to ensure that any good done in the design stages is carried forward in the future, tracking materials in their future journey is important. Material passport data integrated into BIM models can help track these new and reused materials and components in existing and new construction with a digital thread. With this thread, each item can be easily identified with the associated material characteristics and asset history integrated in the software, making tracking materials and buildings simple. So to do this correctly, we should emulate what the more advanced sectors are actually doing now, such as car manufacturers, making investments into digital twins, aka intangible assets, to eliminate resource waste of the tangible assets. Making this material data and creating BIM models should be done at all stages of the design process, including stage 3. But not only does a BIM model help to inform the embodied and operational carbon, it can also provide circularity metrics for early design analysis through to stage 4, aiding the architect in making fully informed decisions at all stages of work. So thank you for your attention. And if you have any further questions or would like to discuss further, I'll be checking the Miro board later, or please reach out using my contact details provided here.
Thank you so much, Taleen. That was absolutely brilliant. So much info. I think we're all going to have to re-watch this on YouTube afterwards. we're just going to go straight into questions now. We've had a few in the chat. A question for Georgina from Eleanor Lasota. By prioritizing the specification of reused materials over recycled ones, how can we assess and advise clients of the likely lifespans of reclaimed materials where material passports haven't been used in the past? Are there strategies to help clients buy into the risks until material passports become more common practice?
That's a fantastic question, and definitely one that kind of comes up sort of time and time again with clients. I think getting the right members of the technical team in early is really important. I suppose from a aesthetics point of view, is getting the architects to kind of help envisage how to reuse that material, but it's getting your engineers in. I think the case that I looked at of the sort of glass sort of screens, we had our acousticians and our fire engineers in quite early just to talk through what are the risks of complying with current building regs, and what do we need to do to get the right paperwork in place to make sure that it can be reused, and then kind of potentially working with the supply chain to make that happen. And similar with sort of structures and any sort of facade panels, if you get the right engineers in, they can help you sort of look at what the lifespan is left on that, and what the opportunities and what needs to be done to upgrade it to current standards. So.
Great. Taleen, did you want to add something to that?
No, I think Georgina answered that really well.
Okay, great. So we have a question. This is for Taleen. Should the contractor need to specify an alternate material from the original specification, such as in a value engineering scenario? How do you ensure that the new specification meets the sustainable and circular qualities intended?
That's a really good question. Should they not be able to, especially in a value engineering scenario, then we do provide our material passports, or we can provide our material passports, which they can compare new materials to in terms of the circularity or the material content and such. But we can also provide a series of questions that the contractor can ask the manufacturer directly, including what's the breakdown of a product in terms of percentage of each component part and recycled content? Does the product contain any red list materials? Is the resource renewable or finite? What is their disposal or end of life scenario? Will the manufacturer have a take back program? Because they don't always have this information available in report format, but they will answer questions via email. So then by asking those questions and getting those written answers, we can then compare that to the material passports that we collected for our previously specified materials.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. There's a question here from Jiang Le for Georgina. Based on your case study, which looked at applied CE principles, how did the overall cost compare to the traditional model? Were there challenges during the process?
Oh, yeah, I think the cost one always sort of crops up. I think it varies from project to project. I think there's kind of two projects like I mentioned. One had a kind of high circular economy sort of driver from the clients. So I think it probably was fairly sort of cost neutral with cost savings, because we were driven down the route of just designing out lots of the kind of finishes. So we actually use less materials, and there's a kind of less cost associated with that. In terms of the arena of looking at that future adaptability piece, again, because the conversations I've had early around the sort of zoning of building services, then I suppose the cost of not doing that is probably not as nuanced or as obvious, but the client could see there's a huge value in increasing that utilization in the future. So yeah, I think circular economy is thought about early. It doesn't have to cost much more. I'm sure just like looking at different materials, it might do, but I think it's having that whole sort of value framework discussion with the client, so you can understand where the costs are and whether it's worth doing.
Great.
I might be able to jump in there.
We have a question here for. Oh yeah, sorry. I can't
Anna.
see. I'm reading the questions.
I would also say that for some of the projects, I think that there's a transfer of costs. So there might be more costs in the labor of materials, so that you can actually deconstruct and then clean the material and store it, and then less on cost of potentially new materials. And same to go with, I guess, the architectural and structural engineering services, that you'd put more time into the front end of a project where you're doing a lot of planning and material auditing and things like that, and then perhaps less time on the back end. So kind of balancing it out. And there are a few different case studies where that was actually applied in Sweden at the IVL Sustainability Institute there, where they did a full retrofit of 3 different offices where they used almost all reused materials from their offices, and their time sheets and then their money calculations showed that they actually just transitioned where money and time was going rather than adding money or time to the project.
Great, great to know. Thanks for those examples. We've got a question. I think this is for both of you. What are your top 3 tips for a company that has never looked at circular design principles before, how to integrate them into their design process? That's from Matt B. Because you both gave us, like, 28 tips. So.
Top 3, gosh. I think, well, sort of BREEAM is definitely not the be all and end all in terms of achieving high sustainability goals, but I think because that's been done on a project anyway, that's quite a good entry point just to get yourself familiar with some of the principles. So I think you don't have to dive in and create the ultimate circular building. Obviously, that's where we kind of want to be, but I think taking a few steps and just using tools and design processes that you're familiar with first, you can then start to explore some of the principles.
Yeah, I would add to that, utilizing the decision tree. There are a few different decision trees, but the one from the GLA Circular Economy guidance is quite useful in that it guides you through asking the questions, and that will lead you to a lot of the even more questions as well as answers, and actually implementing circular economy principles in the design, because it's hard to just nail down 3 only.
Yeah. We're running out of time. I think I'm just going to ask one more question, though. We've had a comment from Charles Harrison: brilliant presentations, Georgina and Taleen, so much useful information. It looks like there could be an increased need for expertise in specifying, processing and procuring appropriate materials. Do you have any thoughts about recruitment and training programs for bringing in and upskilling the people required?
I don't know if that's a question for the architects and structural engineers, or actually the laborers, the people that would be the deconstruction contractors. And I think from my perspective is that probably architects and structural engineers actually they're quite flexible in that they would just need to take from a different set of procurement questions and a different set of detailing, like a different library for detailing for disassembly. Rather, the contractors and deconstruction contractors might need to be retrained, and that would open up a whole new job market, I think.
Great. Georgina, have you got a comment for that?
Yeah, it's probably a bit kind of client education sort of piece as well, I think is really important. I think there's a perception that new is best. I think it's, like Taleen said, it's for the design teams to sort of challenge that sort of perception. And then maybe I suppose at the sort of supply chain end as well, I think, yeah, creating that kind of market for refurbished and upcycled goods and recovery, probably some sort of skills needed there to, yeah, make that kind of a bit more vibrant and have that supply chain available for when design teams are specifying more sort of circular, that they can actually find the right products to match that.
Yeah, it will definitely get easier when there's momentum. Okay, thank you both for all those answers, and thank you everyone for your questions. As we said, the questions will be put on the Miro board, so please do visit the Miro board and carry on the discussion over the next couple of weeks. I'm just going to tell you about our next event in 2 weeks' time. This is stage 4, technical design. We'll be discussing all kinds of exciting things then, and the tickets are available on Eventbrite. So please, please do go to that page. And lastly, perhaps even more excitingly, is we're having a social. If you've been enjoying the love you to get involved and to get to know you, you absolutely don't have to be an expert to join. It's all about enthusiasm, so please don't be shy. We'll be hosting a a group social on the 3rd of March at 6:30. That is next Wednesday. Please get it in the diary and join us for chat over whatever you're drinking. We have an Eventbrite link for that as well. And the ACAN team behind the scenes, and of course, all of you attendees. Thanks very much for joining, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.